Good evening, everyone. My name is Jeffrey Michaels, and I'm the IEN Senior Fellow at eBay. I'd like to welcome all of you to eBay's seminar series on U.S. foreign policy. The series is part of a joint initiative of eBay and the Barcelona Institute of North American Studies that aims to promote discussion of U.S. foreign policy related topics by inviting both scholars and practitioners to share their research and provide their insights. This evening, we'll be focusing on a subject very close to home, namely the relationship between Spain and the United States, where it has been, where it is now, and where it is going, especially with the change in administration in Washington. With us this evening to enlighten us on this topic is Dr. Carlota Encina, who is the Senior Analyst for the U.S. and Transatlantic Relations at the Real Instituto Elcano in Madrid, and she also teaches International Relations at the Universidad Francisco de Vitoria. Dr. Encina is a well-known commentator and has published extensively on Spain's relationship with the United States, and she specializes in the fields of security and defense. Among her publications, a recent one that I found especially valuable and can highly recommend was a piece that she wrote, I guess about a month ago, or at least a few weeks ago, for Elcano, entitled Spain and the U.S. from Trump to Biden. I must embarrassingly confess that one reason I really look forward to your talk this evening is that my own knowledge of the U.S.-Spain relationship is more or less limited to the Spanish-American War, hardly an optimal time. So in the interest of being brought into both the 20th and 21st centuries, I'm most curious to hear what you have to say about where the relationship is today. Before I turn over the floor to Dr. Encina, I just mentioned to our participants, if you have any questions, you'll need to enter them into the chat box. To find it, you go down to the lower right-hand side of the screen where you'll see a purple box with a couple of arrows. If you click on that, it will open up, and then you'll see the icon on the lower left-hand side. You can enter any questions you have into that box. I would ask if you do have any questions to also identify your name and any affiliation. So Dr. Encina, welcome to the seminar, and I very much look forward to your presentation. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you very much for the presentation and for these amazing invitations. I'm going to talk about the relationship between Spain and the U.S. First of all, I will say that the relations between Spain and the U.S. are rooted in historical ties that date back to 1778, when Spain provided military and financial assistance to the emerging nations during the American War of Independence. And since that time, Spain and the US have become friends and allies. Over the years, the governments of both nations have undertaken efforts to promote bilateral relations. The defense and security cooperation is a key component of this bilateral relationship. On the other hand, we have the economic relationship that has also grown significantly. I think it's important to underline that the flow of the Spanish FDI to the US has been significantly developed, particularly over the past 15 years, rising more than fivefold in the last decade, and now even exceeds the equivalent US FDI in Spain. However, I do believe that the relationship could and should grow even more. The outcome of the election in the US, with a victory for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, was well received in Spain. But it should be noted, however, that bilateral relations have undergone a difficult period, especially in 2020. It is also true that Donald Trump's entry to the White House was not at first a major change in bilateral relations. With the US administration endorsements of the Rajoy government, events in Catalonia, and also a degree of harmony in some international issues, such as the crisis in Venezuela and North Korea. But Washington protectionisms and the replacement of Spain's conservative government with a socialist one in June 2018 started to have a certain impact on relations. Contributing to this was the US president's opposition to a considerable number of the principles and values that define Spanish foreign policy, such as the defense of multilateralism and European integrations, among others. The lack of political affinity becomes even more apparent with Spain's new coalition government in December 2019. On the one side, there was a transactional US government, and on the other side, there was a multilateral and international Spanish government. So the ideological gap between Madrid and Washington was huge. It was then that the COVID-19 pandemic appeared and spread around the world, a situation that aggravated and intensified some of the trends already seen in the US administration, like the lack of interest in leading the international response to the pandemic. So the Washington response to the pandemic and the death of George Floyd in June 2020, and also the Donald Trump's refusal to accept the elections results and the events that took place at the Capitol Hill in January, all undermining the poor impression in Spain of the Trump administration's conduct throughout his term. So we have a new administration in Washington. The election of Biden and Harris has been, as was to be expected, warmly welcome in Spain. Right now we have in front an administration that is hope will be more friendly, a closer ally, and a more predictable bilateral partner. Spain has to deal with an administration that is less transactional and more multilateral, that seeks more cooperation and less confrontation with its partners and allies. All this plays out in Spain's favor. But the US is returning to a world that is not what it was, with growing nationalisms, with democracy on the back foot, and an increasing rivalry with China. So the world is not the same, and the leadership of the US is not going to be the same either. So Spain has to take into account three things regarding this new administration. First, that Joe Biden's top priority during 2021 will be domestic challenges. This situation may place a limit in terms of both resources and time on his international agenda, but it is also true that his main priorities, that is COVID-19, the recession and climate change, cannot be completely addressed without his partners, mainly European. Secondly, there will be tensions between his domestic and international priorities. Joe Biden's principal Build Back Better made it clear that his #1 priority is to rebuild the economy at home before embarking upon new international commitments. Think about the TTIP, for example. His Buy American initiative, this is a domestic purchase plan, will be watched closest by other countries and by Spain. For example, if access to US contracts is diminished, or if companies will be excluded from the US huge government procurement market when Washington is making massive investment. And this could be seen, this Buy American initiative could be seen as against the efforts to rebuild trust with allies. The Biden team has also coined the concept of foreign policy for the middle class. That means the administration's new international commitments will be at the service of improving the lives of the US workers and businesses. So these organizing principles suggest, for example, that the US is not necessarily going to resume its traditional leadership position of unequivocally defending free trade practices, but rather protecting in the first instance its consumers, its businesses and farmers. And lastly, the new administration is back on this international stage, but more than ever hopes that other countries too will take a step forward. I mean, making more efforts on defense, working together on China, and resolving trade issues, as well as tackling the global challenges such as the pandemic and climate change. So This depends not only on Washington's attitude and will, and it will also require an effort from its partners and allies in accordance with the needs of all. So, what are the challenges for Spain with this new administration? First of all, I would say that Spain should have started looking years ago for the appropriate challenge for more intense bilateral relationship. During the Trump administration, if you remember, I mean, and its preference for bilateral channels instead of multilateral channels, Spain should take advantage of these situations. But at the end, I mean, Spain didn't take advantage of this. Instead, Spain decided to protect itself from the Trump administrations. I'm thinking about the tariffs, the 2% defense budget, for example, by increasingly steering relations toward multilateral channels and toward Brussels. So I think the main challenge is to strengthen bilateral relations. And this is the main element that needs to be addressed because conducting relations with the US exclusively through the transatlantic channels of the Brussels-Washington connections, it could deprive Spain of its potential and relegate issues that are important for Spanish society, but maybe not so urgent in Brussels. Secondly, Spain should change its approach to the US. Now more than ever, Spain should take the initiative to make its interests more apparent and work on a more strategic view of bilateral relations. This will not be easy since Spain remains neither a priority nor a problem for the US. Spain has a scarce visibility in the US. And this is not going to be easy because everything points to a diplomatic scramble between various countries in Washington that after 4 years of the Trump administrations are trying to get close to Biden's team in hopes of establishing a special relationship with the new administration. Germany, for example, is already the focus of attention for Biden's European team. Italy is competing for prominence on the basis of chairing the G20, and the UK does not want to see any harm come to its relationship with the US and is pushing hard for the G7 and the climate summit in Glasgow. So Spain needs to look for a way of making its mark clearly and firmly. Another challenge is the military relationship. As I said before, a key element in the bilateral relations, and namely Washington's criticism on Spanish expenditure on defense. I'm talking about the 2% target that was agreed at the NATO summit in 2014. The fact that Spain is an active participant in international security and peacekeeping operations, and this is an asset for the bilateral relations, for the bilateral relationship. I mean, I'm thinking about Libya, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Iraq, the Balkans, piracy, the Sahel. Even if Spain has exceeded the 20% target established in terms of spending on military equipment in NATO, these facts do not, in US eyes, exempt Spain from this commitment. I mean, for spending the 2% of the GDP on defense issues. On the other hand, the basis will continue being a central element in bilateral relations, and the presence of US troops will continue in the medium term. This has not prevented news stories emerging about the possibility of Morocco having offered the US a naval base as a replacement for Rota. It is true that Morocco is a long-standing and important ally and partner for the US, but I think this is not a zero-sum game, and Rota continues being a key element for the Pentagon, for getting to critical regions, and for its system of logistics, as well as being home of the 4 Aegis destroyers that make up a part of NATO anti-missile system. At the same time, we must wake up strategically and show the US and the Biden administrations that we are a strong and unable partner, that we continue to have a role as a gateway to the rest of Europe, to the Mediterranean and Africa. It is worth being alert to the new factors that are appearing in bilateral relations in the defense and security fields, such as artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and the defense of outer space, which are taking on increased importance. Unless there is cooperation on these technological areas, it will become more and more difficult to achieve interoperability on the ground, to the detriment of bilateral relations. It is the technological field and the digital field more broadly that is permeating each of the sectors of current bilateral relations. On this point, the ambition of European technological sovereignty, the Chinese technological model, and the scope for cooperation between Brussels and Washington on differences regarding privacy and data regulation and the taxes on giant tech companies are going to be the key. Another challenge could be Latin America, always an important part of the bilateral agenda, and will again be a challenge for the relationship, in particular in terms of Venezuela and Cuba. There have always been consultations between Spain and the US, given that both have major strategic, political, and economic interests. It is clear that Spain cannot depend on Washington when it comes to deploying its presence in Latin America, but at the same time, it ought to take into account US interest in the region. And here we have to talk about China. There is a growing presence and dependence on China in the region. Most of the countries have decided to embrace a pragmatic stance and maintain friendly ties with both Washington and Beijing. So the US, China, and also Spain are among the 3 top investors in most Latin American countries. With a Biden administration, the US and Spain could act together to redefine alliances and secure Western economic and geostrategic interests in the region. We can work together. I mean, Spain and the US can work together in order to reinforce efforts to develop democracy and improve rule of law in the region, but also, I mean, talk about vaccination plan and digitalization issues. So Latin American is a challenge in this relationship, but at the same time, it's an opportunity when we talk about China and the growing presence and dependence on China in the region. This could be an opportunity. Talking about other opportunities, the new administration wants Congress to recover its traditional role in US foreign policy to a large extent as a consequence of this foreign policy for the middle class. And Spain could make the most of this opportunity to strengthen the scarce ties that exist with the 2 houses of the US Congress, something that has been excluded from the Spanish agenda for too long. Spain should cultivate supporters in US governments, should make members of Congress and others in the government aware of the issues and concerns of the Spanish people and the country. Another opportunity, I think, I mean, there are important points that both governments share, and this is an opportunity because this can strengthen relations and consolidate affinity. Both countries support multilateralism, back global governance, and share the goals of climate transition and digital transition. So this is also an opportunity for both countries. For its part, Spain should make the most of a dynamic US market, a market that is trying to make up lost ground after the setback of the pandemic, keeping one eye on the infrastructure plan that the Biden administration will seek to implement. If he succeeds, it could represent a major opportunity for Spanish businesses and multinationals. Another opportunity could be the Summit for Democracy. Spain has welcomed this Summit for Democracy, which Joe Biden has been committed to for so many times. Many of the factors that threaten democracy, not only in the US but in many other Western countries, such as disinformation, political interference, economic inequalities, and fear of interdependence and globalizations. All these issues can only be addressed in a collective way. So the summit is an opportunity to address all these issues. Spain has reiterated its interest in actively contributing to the success of this event. So again, here we have another opportunity for the bilateral relationship. Lastly, Spain should support and commit to a restoration of the image of the US in Spain, which has been damaged over recent years. It is a major factor in constructing any bilateral relationship because, it rests on the support of the public opinion of both sides. According to a recent report from the European Council on Foreign Relations, 67% of Spanish think that the US political system is wholly or partly broken. 79% of Spaniards think that China will certainly or in all probability overtake the US. 71% of Spaniards think that Europe should have its own defense capability. Only 31% of Spaniards trust the US and its ability to mold the world. So people are happy in Spain and in Europe with Biden, but there are still many doubts about whether there may not be another electoral reversal in 4 years, and therefore the mistrust in the country remains high. So that's why I think Spain should support and commit to a restoration of the image and the trust in the US. And to conclude, I will say that the arrival of a new US president is always an opportunity to give new impetus to the bilateral relationship. Washington is returning to international dialogue, is placing a high value on its relations with its traditional allies. This is not insignificant, but there is not going to be any kind of revolution. I mean, there is an administration whose energies will be largely taken up with the country's health emergency and its economic and social crisis and polarization. But everything points to new transatlantic relations, and that will always be positive for Spain. Spain should take advantage of this new impetus in this new administration, and at the same time, Spain should try to make Spanish interest visible in Washington. And Jeff, I think I'm going to stop here.
Well, thank you very much for your presentation. I think that was very, very good in terms of providing a very broad overview of the main issues that are out there affecting the bilateral relationship. I would encourage all the participants to send any questions that you have to me via the chat function. But whilst waiting for any questions you might have, I'd just like to take the opportunity to ask a couple myself. I mean, one thing that you mentioned, certainly that sort of came out very much so in your paper, for example, was this notion that Spain, in a sense, makes its interests heard in Washington via Brussels. And yet, I sort of was thinking about this, to what extent would Brussels actually be better suited actually having its interests heard via Spain in Washington? To what extent can actually use Spain to make its interests heard? I sort of asked that because it would seem to me that Spain does have quite a few advantages if it really wanted to use them to make its voice heard in Washington, although, as you said, it's been reluctant to take advantage of it as much as it might otherwise do. But one question I have with respect to this issue of making one's voice heard, if you go back to, say, 2003 with Aznar and Bush, I mean, was that sort of like the best it can be in terms of sort of the high point of bilateral relations? So we can even phrase it in those ways in terms of at least the Spanish government being sort of on the same platform with the U.S. president in a very, very public way, leaving aside what the rest of the country actually thought of that or not, but at least in terms of prestige reasons, was sort of like that the high point. And even if you go back to that period of time, did Spain actually get very much from that commitment in 2003?
I don't think so. I think when Aznar decided to improve these transatlantic relations and these bilateral relations with George Bush, you have to take into account that at that moment Spain was in the Security Council, and that's a very good aspect that we have to take into account. If Spain were in that UN Security Council, I'm sure that the decisions were quite different. More specifically regarding the Iraq invasion. Having said that, I'm not sure. I mean, I think at that time there was a very fluid relationship, but just immediately with a new government, with the Zapatero government, immediately that fluid relationship and cooperation changed radically. It is true that here we have to talk about the defense cooperations. And even though, I mean, the Aznar government, even though the Zapatero government, or even though Rajoy government and Trump, the base issue still being an important issue both sides. And in some ways, the use of the base shield was like a sufficient. Is sufficient to guarantee a good bilateral relationship. I think that's the main aspect for each administration. I mean, the basis issues. I mean, like sufficient to guarantee a good relationship. And apart from that, the Iraq issue was not positive for the Spanish image and for the Aznar administration. And I think even today, if you hear some kind of political debate or about international issues, I mean, there's nobody here in Spain could have the narrative to, in some way, defend that decision, the support to the Iraq invasion, and that so strong relationships with the Bush administration. It was seen at that time like that we were followers, simply followers, without, I mean, just following the US but not taking actions or deciding something. No, so I'm not sure it does at the end was something positive for Spain.
No, I mean, one of the reasons why I was curious about that issue, certainly from my own observation of US-UK relations, the so-called special relationship, and looking at how the UK would approach that sort of topic, which is, you know, in a sense, you have the US over a barrel because they're looking for allies and they're desperate for allies, and you're there, and now's the time really to cash in your chips. But at the same time, there's always a problem, which is that you don't even know what it is that you want from the U.S.
Yes.
In that sense. And that's sort of, in that sense, I'm sort of curious, you know, what is the wish list? Is there a wish list? Or is it more about, for example, in the Spanish foreign ministry or the political class in Spain more generally, perhaps more about the prestige issue as opposed to the hardcore policy issue?
I do believe that we need to sit down and to think what we want from the US. For example, we have the Latin American issue. There's a possibility to try to cooperate in Latin American, but there's always this fear about US politics, that maybe Latin American countries can think that Spain is following what Washington is just saying. On the other hand, we are not proactive. We don't talk to the US and say, okay, this is a plan. We have a plan for Venezuela. We have something for Cuba. I mean, we really don't know what we want from the US. As I said before, we have to wake up strategically, not only on defense issues, but also in economic issues and in political issues. We need to think about strategically about this bilateral relationship. There is an idea that, as you mentioned before, that the idea that if Spain is increasing its influence in Brussels, is a strong European partner, a strong European country in Brussels, that could help us to improve our bilateral relationship with the US. And I think we need to think on the other side. I mean, just the opposite. That, as you say before, that maybe if we know how to improve our bilateral relationship with the US, that we are going to gain influence in Brussels. But on the other hand, I mean, if you have a look at the crisis, financial crisis, 2008, 2009, since that period, Spain was much more focused on Europe and not in the transatlantic relations. And we were focused on the recovering, on the economic situation of Spain was really hard. And I think we just didn't stop thinking about the US or any kind of strategic alliance. I mean, we were trying to recover ourselves.
Before getting to a question from Mateus, just one quick follow-up on this issue of influence in Washington. I mean, is it your view that, at least for some US politicians in particular, that there's this belief that Spain has a lot of influence in Latin America that it could potentially leverage, or is that not the case?
The US always asks Spain because of the language. I mean, because they know that we understand Latin American issues better than the US. For me, it's astonishing when members of US officials that are in charge of the, as they call, Western hemispheric issues, they don't speak Spanish. And so they're always, I mean, with these administrations, with the Trump administrations, with the Obama administration, there's always officials from the US, from the State Department here in Spain, asking us about Venezuela, about Bolivia, about Cuba. There's always, I mean, there's an exchange, really huge exchange on information, because they know that we know what's going on in Latin America. We really know what's I mean, Latin American people and the country. Apart from that, they take the decisions by their own self. I mean, they don't negotiate with us any kind of politics. And at the same time, as I say, we are not proactive. I mean, we don't create plans. We don't have the initiative in some kind of issues. For example, Venezuela and Cuba. At the same time, today is even more difficult for us because, as a member of the European Union, Latin American, like other issues, our decision-making process goes through Brussels. So that's also difficult for us in order to be proactive or have our own priorities.
This actually leads nicely to the question that was posed by Mateus Lopez, who's a PhD student. What actions could Spain take to develop a more Brussels-independent relation with the US under Biden? maybe push for more active participation in the G20, as you mentioned with Italy. So any thoughts you might have, additional thoughts you might have?
So to be more independence from the U.S.
Sorry, independent of Brussels in relation to the U.S.
Independence of Brussels. I mean, we have to balance. We are a European member, and we have to be proud of it, and we have to take advantage of that. But I mean, just try to imagine Germany. Germany has a strong bilateral relationship with the U.S. This news that the U.S. That the Biden administration is not going to withdraw U.S. troops from Germany. I mean, that's because there is a strong bilateral relationship, because Germany is pushing. There is not Brussels that's pushing there. I think that's Germany. So that kind of things. That kind of actions we should try to do regarding our bases in Rota, regarding Latin American issues, regarding the North of Africa, regarding the Sahel. That's there's this huge importance of that area from Spain, and sometimes it's very difficult for us to bring to Brussels our fears or our insecurities regarding this area. So I think that's an opportunity also to have our own how do you say, strategic autonomy. No, we are talking about a European strategic autonomy. We need a little bit of Spanish strategic autonomy in that kind of issues. I mean, Latin American, North of Africa, and I mean investments in Latin American trade. I mean, for example, the issues of the tariffs. Of course, Brussels has to deal with this issue about the Boeing Airbus issue, but at the same time, I mean, Spanish has to push for avoid tariffs on agricultural products against Spain. So that's our lobby. That's something that we have to do, that Brussels is not going to do.
As you mentioned, the issue of the base, the reversal by the Biden administration of the late Trump administration's decision to withdraw some troops from Germany. One other factor that I perhaps can just add to your answer before was that actually the U.S. European Command was very much dead set against that decision for all sorts of historical reasons, just as they've always opposed moving to Poland and places like this. Which brings me to the Rota base issue, because you mentioned this floating of an idea of a base in Morocco, but I can only imagine that, at least from sort of a U.S. military institutional perspective, they would be absolutely dead set against Morocco, if nothing else, just because the quality of life here in Spain is so much better. And they wouldn't want to have to set up new facilities there and all the rest. So I'm sort of wondering, in that sense, can you just give a bit of background about what the current state of play is with respect to the base issue here, the U.S. bases in Spain? I mean, this issue, for example, of going from 4 to 6 destroyers. Any idea when a decision on that is going to be taken? When did this issue actually first arise?
I mean, first of all, I will say that I mean these about the basis issues. Spanish authorities had managed, as I said before, to separate the basis issues from other aspects of the bilateral relations, in order to ensure that it should not be affected by any political fluctuation in Spain, for example, and even in the hope that use of the bases will be sufficient to guarantee good bilateral relations. Here, at the start of the 2020, there was a change of position, largely prompted by the Trump administration's aggressive policy on tariffs. The Spanish government's message to its US counterpart was, at that time, that the bilateral relations constitute a whole, so that steps taken against Spanish economic interests could have consequences in other areas of the relationship, in particular in defense. So despite the transactional approach of the White House, this change of tactics in the Spanish government went down extremely badly in Washington, and Washington sent an inverse warning and sent to Madrid, don't take for granted that any agreement on the use of the bases will be sufficient to ensure good bilateral relationship in the future. In this period of time, we had this news that Morocco was offering a naval base in exchange of Rota. I mean, this was the concept. But I think we have to think that successive US administrations have viewed Morocco as an important regional partner on security, on trade, on development. Morocco is a designed major non-NATO ally, and the bilateral trade and investment expanded over there was a US-Morocco free trade agreement in 2004. In 2019, Pompeo and the Moroccan foreign ministers convened a high-level US-Morocco strategic dialogue. So the security cooperation is very robust, and Morocco has long been a significant purchaser of US defense materials and hosts an annual military exercises with 1,000 US troops.
So the Western Sahara issue, or
what?
The Western Sahara issue?
Yes, the Western Sahara issue is another issue, but here, I mean, Madrid should have a clear stance on the Western Sahara. We don't have a clear stance about the Western Sahara. So maybe with this decision, could push and force the Spanish government to take a decision. So I think we have to separate. I mean, Morocco is a very important ally. I think Rota continued to be a very important issue for the Pentagon in the midterm. I think there's not yet any official decision about six. I mean, to improve, to bring 2 more destroyers to Rota. I think they are waiting for the review of the global posture. No, the US, I think we need we have to wait. On the other hand, Blinken the other day said that our military presence is going to be robust in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific. So I think we have to think that we are going to have US troops here. On the other hand, I think that the US prefers an improvement on the defense expenditure. I mean, try to reach these 2%, and I mean, and the idea of improve or to send more US troops of more Aegis destroyers. I mean, that's less important. I think they prefer to have, I mean, to have more money, to spend more money in defense expenditure, and I think that's the main priority for the US government. And having said that, I think the US troops and the Rota base is going to be strategic important for the US.
Well, this is an issue that I want to press you on, actually, not so much the Rota base in particular, but a more general issue having to do with 2 kind of related things. The first one, and I suppose there are questions about the extent to which the US will keep its military presence at the sort of relatively current rate, or sort of the current posture, given its increasing interest in Asia on the one hand. And that sort of leads me to wonder what sort of pressure, if any, might be placed on Spain to have some sort of role, military role in Asia. And one reason, in addition to that, I sort of mentioned this, is because of, you see China figuring in basically any conversation that you have in NATO, these days, and it's probably a bit too early to say at the moment, but maybe 2-3 years down the line, the conversation might be much more about how do we have some sort of military presence in the Pacific. So that's one issue, sort of that dual pressure from the U.S. in particular and NATO more generally. But the other issue happens to do with Spain's military commitments abroad. I understand that Spain has reduced its commitment in Iraq recently, and I assume will be, if it hasn't already, reduced it even more in Afghanistan, which then leaves the question about what other sort of commitments, I don't want to say in compensation, because that's probably the wrong way of putting it, but in order to show Spain's presence in these various NATO activities, will there be some sort of pressure to, increase forces, in the Baltic states or something like that, or making more of a contribution, in perhaps to offset this 2% issue? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or if you've heard anything, or if there's been any discussion about what role Spain might play. The fact that there are actually Spanish troops along the border, more or less, with Russia, is sort of an important development in and of itself, or was an important development in and of itself. But if you can envision that, then could you envision something even further afield?
I don't know. I think our presence in the Baltics is very well seen, especially by the Baltic states. That means that Spain has something very important. I'm talking about solidarity. I don't know if imagine that there's some kind of instability, something very close to Spain regarding Morocco, for example, in the north of Africa. Do you think that that Denmark or the countries of the north of Europe are going to send any kind of battleground to the north of Africa? I'm not sure. But even though we don't know what's going to be the situation, Spain sends forces to the Baltic. There's another presence that is very valuable in the US, and is the presence of Spain in Turkey with a Patriot. It's still the unique country in Turkey with a Patriot. And if you go to Washington and you ask in Washington about the US cooperation with Spain in defense issues, they always underline that issue, the presence of Spain in Turkey. So I think we are a very reliable partner for the US, and also in NATO. We do I think more than we can. On the other hand, we have this pandemic, we have an economic crisis. The defense budget are not going to improve, even though we have the commitment is quite difficult, but also because the COVID situation. But Spain and Spanish do believe in this transatlantic solidarity, on the idea that we have to be there. Let's see what's going to happen. And regarding China, I don't know what's going to happen, but China is going to be an issue in NATO. They are also trying to build this new strategic concept. I don't know if China is going to be there, and maybe with that new strategic concept, maybe there's going to be some kind of presence in the Indo-Pacific. On the other hand, I think Europe does not anything. Needs to learn a lot of things about the Indo-Pacific security and defense environment. We really don't know what's going on there, and it's also very far. That means that it's going to be very expensive. I don't know. Let's see. But I think the US is going to push in Brussels and in NATO in order to gain some kind of support in order to face China threats in the Indo-Pacific.
No, and you'll forgive the question. Watching Boris Johnson earlier today,
Yes.
release of the UK Defence Review, talking about being more exactly having more having a bigger presence in the Asia Pacific, a military presence.
Yes.
On the one hand, but also again just because of all this discussion that's been happening within the alliance, within the NATO alliance over the last couple of years, but especially in the last year, in particular, and with the upcoming strategic concept. As well. It's just one of those things that I'm sure is going to be in the air for some time. But one reason I mentioned this as well, and you mentioned the whole issue about commitments in North Africa, for example, that you might find from Northern European members of the NATO alliance. I mean, if you recall back in, was it the Wales summit back in 2014, and then I think 2 years later at the Warsaw summit, especially in 2016, the big debate was, to the extent that there was much of a debate, NATO on two fronts. Will it be looking towards the south, which of course Spain and Italy and so forth were more interested in, France as well, versus looking at Russia as the big threat. And as far as I can sort of gather, now of course you have this third thing, which is sort of overtaking to some extent the other two. Hasn't quite yet, but it seems in that trajectory, which is the China issue. So I'm sort of just more generally curious the extent to which Spain gets carried away in that wave versus basically saying, no, this is our area here and we will focus on this area. Just let us take care of this area, or not take care of it, but essentially be the important power, or one of the important powers actually looking in this region. Whereas everybody else can go off to the Asia Pacific if you want to. Two final questions, if I might. The first one has to do with your being in Madrid and therefore close to the rumor mill. Is there any word about a new U.S. ambassador, or who might be in the running to be the new U.S. ambassador in Spain?
I mean, no, yet. I didn't hear anything about that. I think we need to wait, as you're seeing in Washington. I mean, there are a lot of posts that has to be filled, and the Congress is been involved, I think, in other issues, but I think we need time. I don't know what's going to happen. Spain and Madrid is a very nice place to send an ambassador, but I can imagine that, I mean, they have to decide other embassies that are going to be even more important. And as we are seeing these days, I mean, Blinken and Austin are in Asia. I think the embassies and the cities in the Asia are going to be a priority. And then Germany, and then France, and let's see. I don't know. Maybe I imagine a new ambassador as a similar profile like the last one. I mean, somebody that put a lot of money on the campaign. I don't know. Let's see what's happening. I hope there's somebody who knows Spain and who speak the language and had a lot of interest on economic and investment issues, because I think that was the main that were the main issues, no, at the U.S. embassy here in Madrid: economic issues, investments, entrepreneurs. I mean, that kind of issue. And I think it's going to be that kind of profile, I can imagine.
No, I'm afraid the U.S. has a very, very bad reputation in terms of presidents more or less appointing political supporters and donors and this sort of thing to these high ambassadorial posts, especially in Europe, which are perhaps the most prized posts of all, which you have to donate millions and so forth to political campaigns. One final question has to do with this issue of rebuilding trust. And one thing that you mentioned in the course of your talk was that yes, it's nice to have Biden in the White House, but what's what might happen 4 years from now. And in this sense, I would just sort of mention two things. One is the extent to which the overtures will be made, not so much to Biden, but potentially to Kamala Harris as the next president. I'm assuming that Biden won't go for another term. But I'm also just sort of curious the extent to which you see, again, this point about hesitancy in Spain and amongst the Spanish political class. You know, it's nice to go with Biden, but don't go too far because you might be disappointed in 4 years' time. To what extent is even a Trump return viewed as a realistic possibility here? Is sort of Trump returning a fear that's believed to? Is it something that people actually believe might actually happen?
I mean, I think this. I mean, Spain is. The government and politicians are very optimistic, I think, with these new Biden administrations. At the same time, there is this narrative that I mean, Biden has a different way of doing things, but at the end, China continues to be a threat, and Biden wants to improve its economy domestically, wants to improve the life of the Americans. So there's also this narrative that it's in a different way, but there's always this American first. And I think, I mean, there's this much more trust. There's cooperation, and I think here in Spain we are even more happy because there's some kind of political affinity because of our government of coalition government. But I mean, there are some kind of doubts, and I think for that Spain continue to rely on its policy regarding the US through Brussels. And I think that's one of the reasons, because they know, we know that what's going on in the US is not something. There are structural changes that are happening in the US, so this polarization is still there, even though Trump is not there, and so I think that's why Spain, even though with this government, is trying to bring everything through these Brussels-Washington connections, because they don't know, they have some doubts about what's going to happen in just 2 years with the midterms, or maybe in 3 years with a new general elections. So I don't know. I mean, also there's a lack of proactivity in the Spanish government, and we need to be more proactive and to think more strategically, and it's very difficult. I mean, so it's very difficult. We let's see if new people come here and try to push another way of thinking on, and also international affairs. I mean, this is something relatively new in Spain. I mean, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, we were Elcano Royal Institute, the main and only big think tank in Spain, just one. So it's quite difficult here in Spain.
Well, I gather that the reputation of Elcano, specifically in terms of European think tanks, is very highly rated. I think there was some recent, yeah, some good news recently, as I recall reading. Right. Well, look, as it's now 7 p.m., I'm afraid we will need to bring this session to a close. Dr. Encina, thank you so much for a superb presentation, which I found extremely useful and informative, especially in terms of providing this broad overview of the wide range of issues, opportunities, challenges, and other relevant context that constitutes the U.S.-Spain bilateral relationship. So thank you very much indeed. Before leaving, I would like to briefly remind everyone that with the upcoming Easter holiday, we will be taking a bit of a break, and the seminar will resume on the 12th of April with Dr. Ruta Chaudhary of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, who will be speaking about U.S.-India relations. So I wish you all a very pleasant remainder of the evening and month ahead, and I look forward to seeing you in April. Thanks.